There is something deeply unsettling about the thought of a creature so simple as a worm being able to control another creature as complex as a snail. To think that an organism with no neurons could be capable of manipulating an animal with a nervous system so intricate that it can navigate mazes, learn from experience, and form memories. It swells up the snail's eye stalks, turning them into bright, pulsating orbs that look like nothing so much as a juicy caterpillar wriggling on a leaf. And it drives the normally shy snail out into the open during the day, into the very heart of potential danger. What's going on here is a kind of puppetry, a subtle orchestration of biological processes that turns the snail into an unwitting marionette. Well, remember, the snail isn't doing any of this on its own, and if that happens, the parasite doesn't get to finish growing up. So in some cases, Leucochloridium has actually evolved to make itself less noticeable. More than half of all ant species are infected by zombifying parasites, at least once over their lifetime. It needs to keep its host alive as long as possible because it needs that host to find food and shelter and stay safe. What if it could benefit from having a live host as well as from turning that host into a fruiting zombie? Scientists haven't seen that happen, but it might be possible. Like most parasites, Leucochloridium tends to infect the most vulnerable members of its host population, specifically young snails. It's not clear why. Maybe it is just easier to take over a snail's mind if it hasn't fully developed yet. But whatever the reason, that means that the most robust individuals are the ones most likely to pass on their genes, which isn't great news for the species. On top of that, Leucochloridium is extremely common in its snail hosts, especially in Europe, where half of all Succinia snails are infected. Not only that, but it's not rare for a single snail to have more than one parasite. So if you're a snail, things aren't looking great. But that's just how evolution works. Life always seems to find a way to make it worse. In 2019, researchers showed that a nematode called Halocephalus mephisto, which lives in rotting wood, could turn its beetle host into a fruiting zombie. And nematodes can manipulate their host's behavior in lots of different ways. So who knows what might evolve down the line? Maybe one day a nematode will start using snails as hosts and they'll turn those snails into dancing puppets. Opiocordyceps, on the other hand, is a fungus. It can afford to kill its host right away because it spreads via spores. It doesn't need the body of the dead ant to find food or shelter. It just needs a place to release its spores. That's why it turns the dead ant into a fruiting zombie, so that it can spread to more ants on the forest floor. One of the best known zombifiers is a fungus known as Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, which turns its victims into what some have called fruiting zombies. The corpus then starts to creep into the rest of the ant's body, taking over its muscles and slowly directing it toward the north side of a twig or leaf. The combination of flashiness and sneakiness makes it uniquely good at finding birds. In fact, studies have shown that Leucochloridium-infected snails are 3 times more likely to be eaten by birds than healthy snails. Of course, that doesn't mean that every single snail gets eaten, but it's enough to keep the parasite's populations healthy without wiping out the snail population. So from the parasite's point of view, it's a win-win. The fungus instructs the dead ants to give the forest floor one last bite, locking its jaw in a final bite. Then the spores burst from the back of the dead ant's head and begin infecting more ants. Some strains of Leucochloridium are now transparent instead of brightly colored, allowing them to blend in with the background. They don't flash in the sunlight anymore. Instead, they stay still. It's not quite as flashy, but it works. It has an entirely different kind of behavior from a parasite that literally turns its host into a zombie. And yet, it's no less sinister. Leucochloridium is manipulating its host, rewriting its behavior with chemicals that we don't even know that well yet. We don't know how it turns a snail's eye stalk into a pulsing lava, though we think it has something to do with the way the body moves fluids through its tissues. We also do know exactly what chemicals are involved or what receptors they bind to in the snail's nervous system. But the reason for this strange behavior is pretty simple. Snails hide in dark, damp places, which makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Their soft shells need protection, and being out in the open means being more vulnerable to desiccation, being exposed to UV radiation, and being eaten by daytime predators. So naturally, most snails try to avoid those dangers by staying under rocks or inside the safety of their shells during the day. But Leucochloridium wants to be seen, and since it can't convince the snail to do anything it doesn't want to do, it just convinces the snail to do the opposite of what it wants to do by making the snail seek out sunny, open spaces. The parasite puts itself in a position to be noticed by its final host. the bird that will eat it and allow it to finish growing up. The problem from the parasite's point of view is that most snails carry their houses around with them, making it hard to lure a bird into eating them. So instead of convincing the snail to build a better tower, it convinces the snail to wear a bright blue hat. It's not ideal, but it gets the job done. And yet that's exactly what Leucochloridium paradoxum does. It turns infected snails into what some have called living praying mantises. Parasites come in all shapes and sizes. It craves exposure, driving its host into the light of day when most of its prey is hiding. This behavior is so unnatural that once a snail has been infected, it becomes easy prey for predators like toads and ducks. But Leucochloridium doesn't care about the snail's safety. The parasite wants the snail to advertise its presence, to flash its new eye stalks, bright red or green or purple, throbbing and pulsating in the sunlight. Those stalks are really sacs full of offspring known as tricharia, which are basically tiny worms waiting to grow up and find a bird to infect. When a bird sees these pulsating stalks, it thinks they are a tasty larva or maybe a small worm. So it swoops down and swallows the entire thing. That's when the tricharia are released into the bird's gut, where they grow into adults, mate and lay eggs, beginning their life cycle anew. Some, like head lice, feed on skin oil or blood, while others, like mistletoe, steal water and nutrients from their host plants. Then there are parasites like Leucochloridium paradoxum, whose life cycles depend on controlling the bodies and behaviors of their intermediate hosts. This parasite is just one of the millions of organisms that have figured out how to take advantage of other creatures, stealing their bodies or manipulating their minds in order to get what they need to survive. Most parasites, like tapeworms, live inside their hosts, minimizing contact with the outside environment. But Leucochloridium takes the opposite approach. So why does Leucochloridium need to put on such a show? Why not just stay hidden in the safety of the snail's shell? In fact, sometimes it works too well. Sometimes the fake eye stalks are so convincing that the birds think they are actually watching a snail get eaten by another predator. Leucochloridium is a worm. As odd as it sounds, turning your host into a zombie ant is actually pretty common in the world of parasites. Now there are differences between these two kinds of parasites. But what if a parasite could combine the best of both worlds? That said, Leucochloridium seems content with what it's got. The question is, what does it mean for the snails? At least in the case of Leucochloridium, it's hard to blame it. After all, it's just trying to survive.